Add to this that the fathers at Trent, provide themselves with new supports when they give full authority to the apocryphal books. Out of the second of the Maccabees they will prove purgatory and the worship of saints, out of Tobit satisfactions, exorcisms, and what not. From Ecclesiasticus they will borrow not a little. For from whence could they better draw their dregs? I am not one of those, however, who would entirely disapprove the reading of those books, but in giving them an authority which they never before possessed, what end was sought but just to have the use of spurious paint in coloring their errors?
Those are words of John Calvin in his Acts of the Council of Trent with the Antidote, written a year after the Council of Trent had met. And as you can see, he accuses the council of taking up arms and using books and raising books to heights they never before had achieved, only to bolster Catholic doctrine. This has been a constant narrative that has been going on within Protestantism for years. In today's show, what we're going to do is we're going to give a little bit of evidence that Calvin was wrong. In fact, we're going to look at a very little known local council that met about 18 years before the Council of Trent and see what it had to say about the canon of Scripture. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right, the topic of today is on a little-known local council, the Council of Sens. It's also sometimes known as the Synod of Sens, sometimes as the Council of Paris, because it actually met in Paris, even though it's called Sens. And it met about 18 years before the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, when it defined a canon, that occurred April 8th, 1546. Council of Sens met in 1528. And this is an interesting council, and I think it puts to lie some of the comments John Calvin makes in his Antidotes, because what it shows is that this local council, even before the Council of Trent gets off the ground, before the first session even meets, there was already an understanding that the use and authority of the church had already spoke to the issue of the canon, and that was being violated by Luther and other Protestant reformers. But before we look at what Sens has to say in this regard, I want to talk a little bit about its background, because Sens, along with several other cities in France, had been a city that had reoccurring local synods or councils. And these councils were met basically to reform the church, to help stabilize the church during controversies and troubled times. And this goes way back into antiquity, as you can see. The session we're looking at is the one that occurred in 1528. And it's this session that it takes up subjects in regards to Lutheran incursions into France, probably speaking to, of course, the Lutherans and the Huguenots and so on. And so the reason why Sens picks up these issues is because of this long-held tradition. As Hayden and Greenshield says,
in short, the bishops of Sens in 1528 proclaimed the program of the Catholic Reformation long before the opening of the Council of Trent in 1545. It is no surprise that the earliest full statement of the program of the Catholic Reformation in France came from the Provincial Council of Sens of 1528.
Now, surprisingly little is written about this particular council. I found a helpful paragraph in a book recently published, What Happened at the Council of Trent by O'Malley. And O'Malley describes the background of this council as follows.
By far the most important of these gatherings was the Council of Sens convened in Paris on February 3, 1528. With the twofold aim of combating heresy and reforming the Church. Its decrees were published on October 9. They took aim at Luther as their principal target, but also condemned Melanchthon, Karlstadt, François Lambert, and Ecolampadius. Formulated and edited by the well-known theologian from the Paris Faculty of Theology, Jos Klichtov, They began with an attack on Luther's teaching on justification and, more specifically, on the relationship between faith and works. The list anticipated to a remarkable degree issues the Council of Trent subsequently took up. That is true even though Trent in some cases, as mentioned, decided not to decide. The decrees of Sens were known and respected far beyond northern France, as evidenced by the fact that at Trent Italian and Spanish bishops invoked them when it served their purposes.
So indeed, Sens anticipates a lot of the issues that will be brought up and addressed at the Council of Trent 18 years later. One of those issues also includes the canon of Scripture. And of course, since this is the Apocrypha Apocalypse, that's why I'm bringing it up today, is because it does speak to the canon. So here's what Sens says about the canon and what the reformers need to do in regards to respecting the canon. I give you the Latin and also the English on the bottom. Please forgive me for typos because I got the Latin text from Mansi, and Mansi unfortunately is a bit archaic and the font isn't always that clear. So to the best of my ability, here's what the Council of Sens has to say back in 1528.
In recounting the books of canonical scripture, which does not follow the prescription of the Church's use and authority, the sacred Third Council of Carthage, decrees of Innocent and Gelasius, and in the end rejects the catalogue of books defined by the Holy Fathers. For him, the broken cisterns, which they cannot contain, and which, despising the visions of the orthodox fathers, follows the judgment of their own spirit.
So there's a couple of things that strike me as interesting about this decree. It's talking about the Protestant reformers, that they do not follow the prescription of the Church's use and authority. In other words, not only is it do they not follow the books that are in use as sacred scripture by the Church, but that the Church has already spoken with authority in regards to the canonical scriptures. And as you can see in the Latin, that is exactly what they say, the canonical scriptures. Second interesting point is notice that they refer to the Third Council of Carthage. That heads the list of use and authority of the Church. As you know, the Third Council of Carthage repeats and reaffirmed the canon given at the Council of Hippo a few years earlier, and that is the Catholic canon that was eventually adopted at Florence and at Trent. So Carthage is seen here as an authoritative act on the Church that gives the canon of Scripture, followed by the decree of Pope St. Innocent I. This was done, I think, around 405, if memory serves me correctly, in which essentially Pope Innocent receives letters from a bishop in Gaul, Expersius, and one of the questions is, which books does the Church accept as canonical? Innocent's reply to Expersius's question is part of this letter, and it's deemed authoritative in the Church. In fact, Pope Nicholas I in the 9th century speaks about Innocent's letter to the bishops of Gaul, or modern-day France, that this is a long-held law of the Church that was accepted. So, interesting enough, here we have a later council in France, and what are the first two things they mentioned? The Third Council of Carthage, that defined the canon as canonical, and the Deuterocanons included in that, intermixed with the proto-canonical books without any distinction or qualification, followed by the letter of Pope Innocent I to the bishops of Gaul. Again, proto-canonical, deuterocanonical, intermixed, all affirmed as canonical, and Gelasius. So this, we could call it pseudo-Gelasius, the decrees of pseudo-Gelasius. But nevertheless, again, reaffirms the same category. So notice that's what's trotted out is this appeal to the 5th century church councils in North Africa, and of course, a couple of papal decrees. Now, if what John Calvin says at the beginning of this video is true, and Trent just innovated and gave books that never had authority, suddenly they get authority, well, this was not how the Council of Sens 18 years before Trent and 19 years before Calvin saw it. They saw it as part of the law of the church. And so I think this is just one of several lines of argument that can be made, that when the Fathers of Trent had reaffirmed the canon, that simply they rubber stamped the canon that was given at the Council of Florence, which met a couple hundred years earlier, again, way before the Protestant Reformation. They rubber stamped the North African councils, and it was part and parcel of the law of the church, especially in the West, in regards to the canon of Scripture. So I wanted to throw this in because recently we did an interesting live program, Father Christian Kappas, where he was talking about the reception of the North African canon within the Eastern Church, specifically within Russia. And so I just wanted to put this program out because I think it feathers nicely with what Father Kappas was saying about the reception of these canons and their incorporation into canon law. And also, I think it's just a great little defeater for John Calvin and his supposed Trent pulling a rabbit out of the hat and making books more authoritative than they never were before. So it's a short video this week, but nevertheless, I hope you appreciate it. If you do, don't forget, please sub, hit that like button, tell your friends about the channel. Truly appreciate it. Till next week, I'm Gary Machuda. Take care. Bye-bye.